In the winter of 1980, a young engineering student named Bob Diamond sat in his apartment in Brooklyn, staring at a set of blueprints that according to the city of New York did not exist. For decades, the residents of Cobble Hill and Brooklyn Heights had whispered about a ghost under Atlantic Avenue, a massive, forgotten tunnel that had once swallowed locomotives and secret history alike. But the official record was clear. The Department of Public Works, the transit authorities, and the city historians all maintained the same firm, institutional stance. There was no tunnel. They claimed it was a myth, a bit of urban folklore passed down by grandfathers who had stayed too long in the taverns. They said the blueprints Diamond was looking at were for a project that was never completed, or perhaps a temporary excavation that had long since been filled with dirt and forgotten. But Diamond had spent months in the dusty corners of archives that most people never bothered to visit. He had found a fragment of a map from 1855. He had found a construction ledger from 1844. And he had found something else, a small, nondescript manhole cover in the middle of a busy intersection that seemed to lead to nowhere. On a cold morning in 1980, Diamond convinced a city crew to let him pry up that cover. He lowered himself into the darkness, crawling through a narrow utility pipe for 70 feet, the smell of wet earth and century-old rot filling his lungs. He reached a solid wall of brick and dirt, and with a sledgehammer he had brought with him, he began to swing. On the fourth swing, the wall didn't just crack, it crumbled. The air that rushed out of the hole was cold, stale, and smelled of wood smoke and iron. When Diamond shone his flashlight through the gap, he didn't see a filled-in trench. He saw a massive, vaulted chamber of red brick, stretching into the blackness as far as his beam could reach. He had found the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel. It had been sealed for 119 years. And the reason it had been erased from every map, denied by every official, and buried under a century of silence was not because it was obsolete. It was because the tunnel held the receipts for a series of crimes, both political and financial, that the architects of modern Brooklyn couldn't afford to have brought into the light. If you find these forgotten corners of history worth your time, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tap the like button. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who would never otherwise hear them, and it costs you nothing but a second. Now, let us go back to 1844, to the birth of the tunnel, and to the man who built the world's first subway and then watched as his own city tried to pretend it never happened. To understand why the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel was sealed in 1861, you first have to understand what Brooklyn was in 1844. It was not a borough of New York City. It was a separate, thriving city in its own right, a place of massive industrial ambition. The Long Island Railroad, or the LIRR, had a problem. They wanted to connect the commerce of Manhattan to the ports of Boston. The easiest way to do that was to run a train from the Brooklyn waterfront all the way to the eastern tip of Long Island, where a ferry would take passengers across the Sound to a waiting train in Connecticut. But the streets of Brooklyn were already crowded. Steam locomotives were loud, terrifying to horses, and frequently set fire to the wooden awnings of storefronts with their sparks. The city of Brooklyn passed an ordinance: no steam engines on the surface of Atlantic Avenue. The railroad had two choices: stop their trains at the city limits, or go underground. The man they hired to solve this was an engineer named William Henry Harrison. He proposed a project that was, for its time, considered a feat of impossible engineering. He would dig a trench half a mile long, right down the center of Atlantic Avenue. He would line it with massive granite blocks and cap it with a brick arch that could support the weight of the city above it. It was the world's first subway tunnel, built 20 years before London began its underground and nearly 60 years before New York City would open its first subway line. The construction was a marvel of decentralized labor. Hundreds of Irish immigrants, many of whom had just arrived in the country, dug the trench by hand with shovels and pickaxes. They laid the brickwork in the flickering light of oil lamps, working 24 hours a day to meet the railroad's deadline. When it opened in May of 1844, it was hailed as a triumph of American ingenuity. It was the gateway to the future. For 17 years, the tunnel was the heartbeat of Brooklyn's economy. Every day, massive steam locomotives would descend into the darkness at the waterfront, their whistles echoing through the brick vault as they pulled carloads of goods and passengers toward the east. It was a closed loop of profit. The railroad owned the tracks, the tunnel, and the land at the end of the line. But as the 1850s progressed, the relationship between the railroad and the city began to sour. The tunnel, which had been built to keep the streets quiet, had become a source of immense tension. The residents of Cobble Hill, which was then becoming a neighborhood of wealthy merchants and political elites, didn't like the vibrations. They didn't like the soot that seeped up through the ventilation grates. And more importantly, they realized that the land the tunnel occupied was worth significantly more if the railroad wasn't there. This is where the revisionist history starts to matter. If you look at the official record of 1861, it tells you that the tunnel was closed because it was no longer needed. The city had banned steam engines within its limits entirely, and the LIRR had built a new route that bypassed the downtown area. The closure is described as a simple matter of infrastructure becoming obsolete. But if you look at the archives of the Brooklyn Common Council from 1859 and 1860, a different story emerges. It was not an obsolescence, it was a shakedown. The city had been infiltrated by the early seeds of what would become the Tammany Hall political machine. Figures like Boss Tweed were beginning to realize that public works projects were a gold mine for kickbacks and land speculation. The railroad was told that if they wanted to keep their charter, they would have to pay a massive tax for the use of the tunnel, a tax that was, in reality, a bribe. The railroad refused. In 1861, just as the Civil War was beginning, the city of Brooklyn gave the order. The tunnel was to be sealed. Not just closed, but physically barricaded at both ends. The official reason given in the newspapers was that the tunnel was a public nuisance and a safety hazard. But the timing was suspicious. The order to seal the tunnel came exactly 3 weeks after the firing on Fort Sumter. At a time when every resource in New York and Brooklyn should have been directed toward the war effort, the city spent thousands of dollars in emergency funds to hire contractors to dump tons of earth and brick into the entrances of the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel. They didn't even bother to remove the equipment. And here is where the story turns from a matter of urban planning into a matter of a cover-up. When Bob Diamond broke through that wall in 1980, he expected to find an empty brick tube. Instead, he found evidence of a panicked departure. He found tools left on the ground. He found coal cars that had been shunted to the side and abandoned. And most famously, he found rumors of an entire steam locomotive, the LIRR Number 2, that had been left behind because it was cheaper to bury it than to haul it out before the seals were completed. Why the rush? Why would a city, in the middle of a national crisis, be so desperate to close a tunnel that it would entomb thousands of dollars worth of iron and machinery? The answer lies in the missing archives. For 119 years, any researcher who went to the Brooklyn City records to find the closing orders for the tunnel was met with a blank space. The files for the Atlantic Avenue project between 1859 and 1862 are simply gone. They weren't lost in a fire. They weren't mislabeled. They were removed. The primary niche of this channel is uncovering the parts of history that were deliberately erased, and the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel is the perfect example of how an entire physical structure can be removed from the collective memory of a city. For over a century, the people of Brooklyn walked over the top of this tunnel every day. They lived in houses whose foundations were inches from the tunnel's brick arch. And yet, if they asked a city official about it, they were told they were mistaken. In the 1950s, when the city was digging new water mains along Atlantic Avenue, workers actually struck the roof of the tunnel. They reported it to their supervisors. The supervisors told them to keep digging, to pour concrete over the hole, and to not mention it in their daily logs. The institutional memory of the tunnel had been replaced by an institutional mandate to deny its existence. Before we move into what was actually found down there, and the darker rumors of what was hidden in the tunnel during the Civil War, I want to remind you that these stories only survive because people like you are willing to look past the official narrative. If you find this kind of deep dive research into the buried history of our cities valuable, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It is the only way to ensure that the receipts we uncover aren't buried again. Now, let us talk about the ghost of Atlantic Avenue and the secrets that 119 years of silence couldn't quite kill. The most provocative part of the tunnel's history concerns the year it was sealed, 1861. Brooklyn in 1861 was a divided city. While the majority of the population supported the Union, the merchant class, The men who owned the warehouses along the waterfront and the shipping lines that traveled south had deep financial ties to the Confederacy. Cotton was the lifeblood of the New York economy, and the sudden outbreak of war was a catastrophe for the men who had built their fortunes on Southern trade. Rumors began to circulate in the 1880s, long after the tunnel had been sealed, that the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel had been used in its final months as a secret depot. The claim was that the railroad barons and their political allies in the city government had used the underground space to store goods and materials that were being smuggled to the South. If you were a merchant in 1861 and you had a warehouse full of supplies that the Union Army wanted to confiscate for the war effort, but you knew you could get 5 times the price if you could sneak them onto a blockade runner headed for Charleston, where would you hide them? You wouldn't put them in a visible warehouse. You would put them somewhere that was already being decommissioned. The tunnel provided half a mile of secure, subterranean storage that was, conveniently, right next to the waterfront. The theory, proposed by some researchers in the late 20th century, is that the sudden, panicked sealing of the tunnel in 1861 was not an act of public safety, but an act of evidence disposal. By filling the ends of the tunnel with dirt and brick, the city and the railroad effectively created a giant vault, protecting whatever was left inside from the prying eyes of federal marshals who were, at that time, scouring the city for Confederate sympathizers. But there is an even darker story attached to the tunnel, one that appears in the diaries of a local merchant named James Lefferts. He wrote in 1864 about an incident that had occurred in the tunnel just before it was closed, an incident involving the murder of a man who had discovered a financial ledger belonging to a prominent Brooklyn politician. The story goes that a group of men were met in the darkness of the tunnel to discuss the disposal of certain city funds that had been skimmed from the construction of the new parks. One man, a low-level clerk who had followed them, was discovered. He was never seen again. When Bob Diamond was exploring the tunnel in the 1980s, he found a section of the floor that seemed to have been disturbed and then repaved with a different type of brick than the rest of the structure. He wanted to excavate it, but the city, citing structural concerns, refused to grant him the permit. This brings us to the core of the buried century thesis: the transfer of competence and the removal of independent oversight. In 1844, the tunnel was a transparent piece of infrastructure built by a private company and managed by a city council that was, at least on paper, accountable to its citizens. By 1861, the tunnel had become a tool of the machine. It was a space that could be disappeared because the people in power own the maps and the records. When a city can decide that a half-mile-long brick tunnel no longer exists, it can decide that anything else no longer exists. It can decide that funds were never spent, that people were never there, and that history began on the day they chose to write the new ledger. The 119-year cover-up was not just about hiding a locomotive or a few crates of smuggled goods. It was about establishing the principle that the city's physical history is subject to the city's political needs. For over a century, engineers and urban historians pointed to the ventilation grates on Atlantic Avenue and asked where they led. They were told they were part of a sewer system that had been abandoned. When residents complained that their basements were damp and that they could hear hollow echoes through the floorboards, they were told it was just the settling of the earth. The city didn't just bury the tunnel. They gaslit 3 generations of Brooklynites into believing that their own eyes were lying to them. Consider the case of the 1911 gas explosion. A section of Atlantic Avenue suddenly subsided, creating a massive sinkhole. The official report stated that a gas main had leaked and caused the earth to collapse. But the photos from the scene, which Diamond uncovered decades later, show something the report didn't mention. The sinkhole didn't reveal a pipe. It revealed a perfectly intact brick archway. The workers who arrived on the scene were not gas company employees. They were city contractors who arrived with truckloads of cement and filled the hole within 4 hours, before any independent reporters could arrive. The archway was the roof of the 1844 tunnel. The city knew exactly what it was. And they chose, once again, to pour concrete over the truth rather than admit they had been lying since 1861. The standard history of Brooklyn will tell you that the 19th century was a time of unprecedented growth and civic improvement. It will show you the Brooklyn Bridge and the grand brownstones of the Heights. And it will treat the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel as a curiosity, a small mistake that was quickly corrected. But the dealer's method, the method of comparing the old maps to the new ones, shows us the cost of that progress. Every time a city forgets a piece of its infrastructure, it is a sign that someone benefited from the forgetting. The Atlantic Avenue Tunnel wasn't a mistake. It was a masterpiece of engineering that was turned into a crime scene and then into a ghost. When Bob Diamond finally forced the city's hand in 1980, the reaction from the authorities was telling. They didn't celebrate the discovery of the world's oldest subway tunnel. They didn't offer him a job or a grant to continue his research. Instead, they tried to stop him. They cited safety regulations. They claimed the air was toxic. They tried to fill the entrance he had opened back up with concrete. It was only because of a massive surge in public interest. The people of Brooklyn were finally seeing the proof of the stories their grandfathers had told them, that the city was forced to allow limited tours. For a few years in the 1980s and 90s, you could actually go down there. You could walk the red brick vault and see the soot from 1844 still clinging to the ceiling. You could see the tools left behind by the men who were told to seal the ends and not look back. But the most important discovery Diamond made was the locomotive. In a section of the tunnel that had been partitioned off by a secondary wall, he found the remains of what appeared to be an 1840s-era steam engine. It was partially buried in silt, but the iron frame and the massive drive wheels were unmistakable. This was the LIRR Number 2. It was the physical proof that the railroad hadn't just closed the tunnel, they had abandoned it in a state of panic. Why leave a locomotive? In 1861, a steam engine was a massive investment, equivalent to millions of dollars today. You don't leave it in a tunnel unless the cost of staying another day is higher than the value of the engine. You leave it because you are afraid of what will happen if the doors stay open a moment longer. In 2010, the city of New York abruptly revoked Bob Diamond's permit to lead tours of the tunnel. They claimed, once again, that there were structural issues and fire safety concerns. They sealed the manhole cover with a heavy steel plate and welded it shut. Today, if you walk down Atlantic Avenue, there is no sign that the world's oldest subway tunnel is 30 feet beneath your feet. The maps have been updated, but the tunnel is once again a ghost. The city says it is for our safety. The revisionist historian says it is because the tunnel still holds secrets that they aren't ready to explain, including the results of the 2011 radar scans that suggested there are multiple anomalies buried behind the walls that Diamond never got to break through. The story of the Atlantic Avenue Tunnel is finally a story about the fragility of institutional memory. We assume that because we live in the age of information, the truth about our world is safe. We assume that you can't just lose a half-mile of brick and iron. But the history of Brooklyn proves that you can. All it takes is a political machine with a motive, a railroad company with a secret, and a century of bureaucrats who are willing to say no, until the people who remember the yes are all dead. The tunnel remembers, even if the city has forgotten. The soot is still there. The locomotive is still there. And the wall that Bob Diamond broke through in 1980 is a reminder that no matter how much concrete you pour over the past, the truth is patient. It can wait 119 years. It can wait longer. When we look at the modern world, we see the infrastructure that they want us to see. We see the skyscrapers and the highways. But beneath it all, in every city in America, there is a third vein, a layer of history that was sealed because it was too expensive, too scandalous, or too inconvenient to keep open. The Atlantic Avenue Tunnel is the clearest example we have of that layer. It is a measurement in brick and dirt of how much our leaders are willing to hide to protect the property of their reputations. The young collector in our earlier story, the one who listened to the Bible dealer, understood that the most ordinary objects are historical documents if you look at them patiently. The same is true of our cities. The next time you walk over a manhole cover, or notice a strange ventilation grate in a place where it doesn't seem to belong, don't take the official explanation at face value. Ask what is beneath it. Ask when it was built and why it was closed. And ask who benefited when the maps were rewritten to show a blank space where a miracle used to be. The Atlantic Avenue Tunnel is still there. It is silent, dark, and filled with the air of 1861. It is waiting for the next person with a sledgehammer and the courage to stop believing. The people who say there is nothing to see. The receipts are buried in the silt, under the iron wheels of a ghost locomotive, behind a wall of red brick that was never supposed to be broken. And as long as those receipts exist, the story of the buried century is never truly over. It is just waiting for someone to let the air back in. The city of Brooklyn in 1844 was a place of decentralized competence. The men who built that tunnel knew how to shape the earth and the stone. They didn't need a centralized federal authority to tell them how to build a subway. They just did it. The closing of the tunnel in 1861 represents the moment that competence was taken away from the public and hidden behind a curtain of professional bureaucracy. For 119 years, the experts told the public that the tunnel was a myth. They used their titles, their positions, and their control over the archives to suppress a physical reality. When Bob Diamond, an outsider with nothing but a set of old blueprints and a sledgehammer, proved them wrong, he did more than just find a tunnel. He exposed the lie of institutional authority. That is why the tunnel is sealed again today. It is not about safety. It is about the fact that an open tunnel is a reminder that the institutions can be wrong, and that they can lie for over a century to cover up their mistakes. As long as the manhole is welded shut, the official version of Brooklyn remains intact. But the brick arch is still there, holding up the weight of the avenue, a silent witness to a time when we built things that were meant to last, and a time when we weren't afraid to go into the dark to find the truth. The lesson of Atlantic Avenue is that history is not what happened. History is what survives the purge. It is the fragments that are left behind in the archives, the anomalies on the radar scans, and the whispers of the grandfathers who refuse to forget. The tunnel remembers. And as long as we are willing to look, the receipts will always be there, waiting in the dark. In the end, we are left with the silence of the tunnel. It is a heavy silence, the kind that only comes when a space has been abandoned in a hurry. If you could stand in the center of that brick vault today, you would be standing in the only place in New York City where the year is still 1861. You would be standing in the world that the railroad barons and the political bosses tried to bury. And you would realize that the only difference between a myth and a history is the person who is willing to keep digging until the hammer strikes hollow. The shop is open once more. The maps are on the table. And the tunnel is waiting. Open the book fully, look past the official record, and read everything else. The truth is not in the headlines. It is in the third vein, where the ghost locomotives still wait in the dark for a rescue that the company decided was too expensive 119 years ago. Look at the receipts. Read the names. And ask yourself what else is buried under your feet, waiting for someone with the courage to break the seal.